There is a moment, maybe you've had it, when you're standing in a kitchen or a garage or a hospital waiting room, and someone says something that would normally set you off, and it doesn't. Not because you swallowed it, not because you gritted your teeth and let it pass. It just didn't need anything from you. You noticed the words land. You noticed something rise for half a second, and then it was already finished, like a wave that touches the sand and pulls back into the ocean it came from. No fight, no effort, no story afterward about what you should have said. No 3 a.m. replay, 3 days later, of the perfect comeback you never delivered. You went back to what you were doing. Maybe you even forgot, an hour later, that it had happened at all. Not because you pushed it down, but because there was nothing left over that needed pushing. If you've spent 60, 70 years watching your own reactions, you know how rare that is. You know how much more common the other version is. The one where a small thing said at breakfast is still costing you peace of mind at dinner. What was that moment in the kitchen? Really? You've spent time learning to see anger clearly instead of being run by it. You've learned to let the first sting be just the first sting, without adding a second arrow of blame and replay. You've started to notice that the anger was never really yours to own in the first place. That it appeared the way weather appears, not the way a signature appears. But this moment in the kitchen is something else. It's not managing the anger well. It's not even watching the anger closely. It's anger arising into a mind that isn't negotiating with it anymore. There's an old word for this, and it doesn't mean what it sounds like it means. Consider a person carrying a long list, folded up in their pocket, of everything today is supposed to look like. The weather is supposed to cooperate. The driver ahead is supposed to move faster. The family member is supposed to remember what they promised. Every hour, the list gets checked against what's actually happening. Most of the list fails. So there's a kind of standing negotiation running underneath the day. A constant, quiet haggling with reality. Push here, pull there, resist this, chase that. It's exhausting in a way that has nothing to do with physical effort, because it never stops, even in the quiet moments, even at 3 a.m. Look closely at that negotiation, and you'll notice it only ever moves in 2 directions. Something you want, and it isn't here yet. That's a pull. You reach for it, chase it, arrange your day around getting it. Something you don't want, and it's already here. That's a push. You brace against it, argue with it, try to make it leave faster than it came. That's the whole mechanism. Not dozens of different problems. 2 movements. Craving is a pull. Anger is a push. Control is a pull. Reaching to make an outcome hold still. Avoidance is a push. Reaching to make an outcome go away. Even regret is a push, aimed backward at something that already happened, and expectation is a pull, aimed forward at something that hasn't happened yet. Almost every emotion that has ever exhausted you, at its root, was one of these 2, wearing a different name. This matters, because it means you don't need a separate strategy for anger, and another for anxiety, and another for grief, and another for the ache of missing how things used to be. Underneath all of them is the same pair of arms, one pushing, one pulling, and both belong to the same thing. What if the deepest kind of peace isn't winning that negotiation? What if it's not needing to negotiate at all? In the earlier teaching on dosa, we named the mechanism. That anger is resistance to something not matching what the mind demanded. We named the second arrow. The extra suffering added when the mind reacts to its own reaction. We named the mirror. How what irritates you in another person often reflects a self that feels threatened, a self that was never as solid as it seemed. There is a word from the old Pali texts, upekkha, often translated as equanimity. But it's worth being careful here, because in English, equanimity can sound like a kind of emotional flatness, a practiced calm, a wall you build so nothing gets through. That is not it. Upekkha is not a wall. A wall still requires energy to maintain. A wall is still a form of resistance, just resistance dressed up as spiritual composure. If you have ever met someone who is very equanimous in a way that feels cold, distant, performed, you have met a wall, not upekkha. Real upekkha is not holding still against the world. It's the mind no longer needing the world to be different than it is in this instant, before the next instant simply happens on its own. Notice something important here. Upekkha, in this sense, is not a technique you apply on top of a feeling. It isn't, I feel angry, therefore I will now generate calm to cover it. That would just be resistance wearing a quieter mask. The same negotiation, now negotiating for a peaceful appearance instead of a satisfying outburst. And a mask, however convincing, still takes energy to hold in place. Upekkha names this from the side of the old Pali texts. But there's another word, from a different branch of the same tree, that names the same territory from a different angle. In the Zen traditions of Vietnam and East Asia, there's a phrase that points to the same freedom from another direction, Vô Su. It doesn't translate cleanly, and that's worth sitting with rather than rushing past. The closest rendering is something like no affair, no unfinished business, nothing pending, nothing owed. Not a person with nothing happening in their life. A mind with nothing left to negotiate about what's happening in their life. No affair is not, I have resolved all my problems. It's, the mind that turns every moment into a problem to be resolved has gone quiet. Here's the mistake almost everyone makes when they first hear this. They imagine no affair as a finish line. Enough practice, enough insight, and one day you arrive at a permanent state called no affair. And after that, nothing bothers you again for the rest of your life. That would just be a subtler, more spiritual version of the same list in your pocket. A demand, a condition. Reality now owes you permanent peace in exchange for years of effort. Notice, that's still negotiation. It's just negotiating for a bigger prize. And there's a second version of the same mistake. Quieter and easier to miss. Some people, once they hear about no affair, start treating every arising of anger as proof they've failed. A flash of irritation at a slow driver, and immediately, I shouldn't be feeling this anymore. I'm supposed to be past this. But that reaction, the disappointment in yourself for still reacting, is just dosa wearing a robe. It's the same old demand, dressed up in spiritual language. Reality is not matching what I decided a developed mind should look like. The negotiation didn't end. It just moved one level up, from the driver shouldn't be slow to I shouldn't still be bothered by slow drivers. The negotiation didn't end. It just changed addresses. So let's look at the mechanism more carefully, because this is where most people quietly misunderstand the whole path. Picture a river that has spent years arguing with its own banks. Every bend, it pushes against the rock, wears against the current, fights the shape of the land it's moving through. This is exhausting to imagine, and it should be, because that's what a mind in constant reactivity is doing, treating every obstacle as something that shouldn't be there. Now picture the same river, except it has stopped needing the banks to be somewhere else. The banks haven't changed. The rocks are still there. The river still bends, sometimes sharply, sometimes over rapids. But there's no more argument in the movement. The river doesn't approve of the rocks or disapprove of them. It simply moves the way water moves when it's water, meeting stone the way stone actually is. This is not the river giving up. It's not the river becoming passive or indifferent to where it flows. The river still moves toward the sea with the same force it always had. What's gone is the friction of wanting it to be otherwise. Here's the part worth sitting with longest. The river isn't achieving this by watching itself very carefully at every bend, checking in each moment whether it's still arguing with the rock. It has simply stopped being a thing that argues. The letting go isn't a maintained effort. It's what's left when the effort of resisting is no longer being manufactured. This is close to what the word Dharma is pointing at in this teaching. Not Buddhism as a religion, not a set of rules to obey, but the process itself. Cause, meeting, condition, moment after moment, unfolding into whatever it unfolds into, the way water always finds the shape of its container without needing to be told to. That unfolding is Dharma, not a philosophy about it. The thing itself, already running. A mind at war with reality is a mind trying to override Dharma, insisting the result should be different before the causes and conditions that produce it have changed. A mind in no affair has simply stepped out of that argument and let Dharma run the way it already runs, with or without anyone's permission. Set the river aside for a moment, because there's a plainer picture of Dharma than any landscape. Think of a cut on your own hand. You didn't design the process that closes it. You don't supervise the blood as it clots, or instruct the skin on how to knit itself back together, or manage the timeline. If you leave the wound alone, clean, uncovered, unpicked at, it heals on its own schedule, following its own sequence, because that sequence was never yours to run in the first place. It was already running before you had an opinion about how fast it should go. Now picture the opposite, picking at the wound because it's healing too slowly, pressing on it to see if it still hurts, reopening it to check whether it's really closing the way it should. That interference doesn't speed anything up. It only adds a new injury on top of the first one, and calls the new injury handling the situation. This is Dharma, not a doctrine, a wound that already knows how to close. The mind that keeps checking, pressing, reopening. That's the same mind that keeps replaying the comment from the kitchen, checking whether it's really over yet, pressing on the sore spot to make sure it still hurts. Every check is a small act of not trusting the process that was already working before the checking started. No affair isn't watching the wound heal, either. That would still be supervision wearing a patient face. It's the absence of the hand reaching to pick at it. Nothing to do, nothing to manage. The wound was never waiting for permission. Stop checking. It was already healing. Think about what the arguing was actually accomplishing. All those years the river spent fighting the rock. Not moving the rock. Rocks don't move for arguments. Not changing the river's course. The banks decided that long before the river had an opinion about it. The only thing the arguing ever produced was wear, erosion, a kind of friction heat with nowhere to go except into the river itself. This is worth being precise about, because it's easy to hear, stop arguing with reality, and think it means stop caring whether the rock is there. It doesn't mean that. The river still meets the rock fully. Every bend, every current, every particle of water actually touches stone. Nothing is being avoided. What's absent is the extra layer, the meta-reaction, the resistance to the resistance, the wanting it to be otherwise that gets added on top of the plain contact between water and stone. Contact isn't the problem. The demand riding on top of contact is the problem. That's the shift from managing anger to no affair. Anger may still arise, a flash of heat when someone cuts you off, a flare when your plans are wrecked by someone else's carelessness. No affair doesn't promise the flash won't happen. What it describes is a mind where the flash doesn't get picked up, doesn't get fed a story, doesn't get turned into 3 hours of replaying the conversation you should have won. The flash arises, and Dharma, cause meeting condition meeting result, simply runs its course. The mind doesn't step in to referee it. Here is where the unmasking most people need actually matters. When people hear, "the mind no longer negotiates with reality," a fear surfaces almost immediately, and it's a reasonable fear. Doesn't that mean giving up? If you stop pushing against what's wrong, doesn't the world just get worse? Doesn't a person who has no complaints become a person who lets anything happen to them? That fear is worth taking seriously rather than waving away. But look at what actually collapses when the negotiating stops. It isn't your ability to see clearly. It isn't your capacity to act. It isn't your care for people you love. What collapses is the belief that clarity and action require a background hum of anger to fuel them. Ask yourself honestly, has your anger, in the moments it ran hottest, ever made your judgment sharper? Or did it narrow your vision to exactly the thing you were furious about, while everything else, the bigger picture, the more skillful response, the people standing right next to you, blurred out? Picture the contractor who shows up late for the 3rd time this month. There's a version of you that meets him already furious, rehearsing the complaint on the drive over, and by the time you're standing in front of him, you can barely hear his explanation. You're too busy waiting for your turn to talk. And there's another version, just as unwilling to let shoddy work slide, just as clear that the schedule matters, but arriving without the 3-day simmer attached. That version notices more, asks better questions, gets a straighter answer, because the contractor isn't talking to someone who's already decided he's the enemy. Same standards, same refusal to be pushed around, less noise in the way of seeing clearly. The very thing that felt like it was protecting your interests was usually the thing most degrading your ability to protect them well. A mind in no affair is not a mind that has stopped caring what happens. It's a mind finally clear enough to respond to what's happening, instead of what it's afraid might happen, or what it resents already happened. When people picture a person who has let go of inner conflict, they often picture someone passive, soft-spoken, withdrawn, maybe a little detached from the sharper edges of life. Someone who has traded vitality for peace. But look again at the river. It hasn't lost its force. A river with no argument against its banks doesn't move slower. Often it moves with more direct, more efficient power, because none of its energy is being spent fighting its own shape. There's a particular version of this misconception worth naming directly, because it shows up so often around people who've spent a lifetime being the one who handles things. The fixer, the one who calls the doctor, who argues with the insurance company, who keeps the family calendar straight. For someone like that, no inner conflict can sound like a threat to the very thing that made them useful. If I stop being someone who gets fired up about problems, will I still be someone who solves them? But notice the sleight of hand in that fear. It quietly assumes anger is what makes a person effective, and calm is what makes a person useless. Look at the people you've actually known who were the most capable in a crisis. The ones who got the ambulance called, the paperwork filed, the family calmed down. Were they the ones shaking with fury? Or the ones who could see clearly enough, quickly enough, to know exactly what needed doing next? No affair isn't the opposite of competence. It's closer to what competence actually looks like once it isn't dragging the extra weight of resentment behind it. The old texts are not describing withdrawal from life. There's an account of a householder named Sita, a wealthy layman known for how clearly he could discuss the deepest points of the teaching despite never having left ordinary family and business life. He wasn't praised for having no problems. He was praised for the quality of mind he brought to the problems he still had. Full engagement, without the constant undertow of inner conflict pulling at everything he did. That's the model worth holding on to. Not a person with an empty life. A person whose life is as full and complicated as anyone's, meeting it without the second, invisible job of negotiating against it at the same time. The freedom from inner conflict was never reserved for those who left ordinary life. It was offered as something available inside it. So, what does someone with a job, a spouse, grandchildren who don't call enough, a body that aches more than it used to, what does this person actually do with no affair? Not much. And that's the honest answer, though it doesn't feel honest until you try it. The next time something lands the wrong way, a comment, a delay, a small betrayal of what you expected the day to give you. Notice if there's an old habit of immediately checking that moment against your list. Notice the automatic verdict. This shouldn't be happening. You don't have to argue with the verdict. You don't have to suppress it either. Just notice the checking itself. The way you'd notice a familiar habit in your own hand reaching for something without thinking. See the negotiation starting up. That noticing, on its own, is often enough to let it run its course without you climbing inside it and making it your job to win. That's the entire practice for today. Not fixing the reaction, not eliminating it. Just recognizing, in the moment it starts, this is the negotiation. And letting it be what it is, the way you'd let a sound pass through a room. You might notice it happens a dozen times before lunch. The traffic light. The email that took 3 days to get a reply. The grandchild who was supposed to call on Sunday. Each one a tiny checkpoint where the mind quietly consults its list and issues a verdict. You're not trying to stop the checkpoints from happening. You're only trying to see them clearly enough that you're not automatically enlisted into arguing on their behalf. Some days you'll catch it after the reaction has already run its full course, hours later, replaying a conversation in the shower. That's fine. Seeing it late is still seeing it. The seeing itself is what loosens the grip. Not forcing an outcome, not scoring yourself on how equanimous you managed to be today. Say a son calls, 3 weeks later than he promised, and there it is, the old, familiar heat. In the past, this might have meant a clipped tone on the phone, followed by a quiet grudge that colored the whole visit. No affair doesn't ask you to fake warmth you don't feel, and it doesn't ask you to pretend the delay didn't sting. It only asks, can you see the checkpoint firing? He should have called sooner. Clearly enough that you're not obligated to defend it? If you can, the call itself, whatever it holds, gets to be just the call, not a referendum on whether you're loved enough. Notice, too, which of the two movements it was. Not a push this time, but a pull. Reaching for the call that should have come sooner, the version of Sunday you had already decided on before Sunday arrived. No affair doesn't care which of the two arms is reaching. Push or pull, the letting go is the same letting go. That's what makes this workable for an entire life, and not just for anger. You're not learning 7 different techniques for 7 different feelings. You're learning to recognize one motion, however it disguises itself, and to let it finish on its own instead of grabbing hold partway through. So go back to the kitchen. The comment that used to set you off. It wasn't that you got better at controlling your anger. It's that, for a moment, there was nothing left to control. Because there was nothing being demanded from reality that reality wasn't already giving. Not a wall. Not a victory. Not the end of the river's movement. Just water, meeting stone. The way water actually meets stone. What would today look like if nothing that happened needed your permission first? May you find peace the way water finds its way around stone. Be well and stay awake.